These are interesting times to be alive. And so much is happening in the world. And perhaps the way to start is by asking some questions. Why was ASEAN formed 50 years ago? What role has it played in the last 50 years? What does the future hold in the next 50 years? And what does this often bandied term, ASEAN unity and centrality, what does it really mean? And how will it be enacted? So let's start with those series of questions. ASEAN is at an inflection point today, and not just because it's 50. It's at an inflection point because the world as a whole has changed. And we are living in very uncertain times. Let's just do a quick scan of what's happening in the world. First, the geostrategic balance has changed and changed dramatically. Never before in human history have 2 billion people suddenly come online, connected to the global economy at the same time. Never before in human history have hundreds of millions of people been raised from abject poverty into a rising middle class. And we've seen this transformation occur since 1978 in China, 1991 in India. And rising economic power must inevitably mean increased diplomatic and military clout. We know that the Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And in fact, some Western commentators mistakenly proclaim the end of history, as if the liberal world order was an inevitable end of this process. And we all know this was mistaken. Japan, do you remember Japan in the 80s that could say no? And in 1991, the bubble burst. They ran out of demographic steam. And demographics is also at play in Europe. And today, Europe confronts existential questions of identity as it grapples with large-scale immigration. And we have witnessed extremism, terrorism, becoming ubiquitous across the world. It's not just a Middle East phenomenon. And America, the hyperpower that underwrote the liberal, rules-based world order as we know it since the Second World War, is now engaged in a major bout of legitimate political questions, questioning its own role in underwriting this world as we know it. So there's no question that the entire geostrategic balance and many of the assumptions and presumptions that we took for granted no longer apply today. Second big change is that the global consensus for free trade, economic integration, and globalization is fraying. We have witnessed populism and nationalism all over the world. It's gained traction in political campaigns, and we witness the rise of populists both on the right and on the left. Free trade has been unfairly blamed for legitimate middle-class anxiety over jobs and wage stagnation, when actually the real problem or the real phenomena is the fact that there is an ongoing digital revolution. And every time you get a new revolution, a new industrial revolution or now a new digital revolution, we know that the first few entrepreneurs, the first few states that get it, make enormous outsized profits and therefore accrue enormous power. And that in this initial phases of a revolution, in fact, you see increased inequality. And it takes time for a Gilded Age to pass and to become a golden age when you get a rising middle class that has been able to master the new technologies behind the revolution. So the point is, there is middle class anxiety. Economic and political institutions are being questioned as never before. And the jobs of today are at risk of becoming obsolete. And the real challenge is not to build walls or not just to redistribute accumulated past wealth. The real challenge is to ensure that our people have the right skills for the new jobs, that the new means of production are democratized, commoditized, so that a new middle class can rise and no one is left behind. The third thing that has changed is that our global world order is being reshaped by the emergence of non-state actors and transboundary challenges, including terrorism, cybercrime, and climate change. These are phenomena which are not confined to neat geographical boundaries, and they don't operate within the usual concepts of the Westphalian nation-state. And the only way to deal with these transboundary global threats, in fact, is to mount a global consensus and global action, whether you're dealing with cyber, climate, or terrorism. And a case in point for us in Southeast Asia is the returning fighters from Iraq and Syria, where we know ISIS has lost ground. And we saw some of returning fighters in Marawi, in the southern Philippines. And there are other potential hotbeds for terrorists in our region. Closer home, we even saw a Singaporean in an ISIS recruitment video. And even our concern about the problem in Rakhine State is also related to our anxiety that this becomes another sanctuary, another hotbed for extremism and terrorism. So the implication here is that these types of problems cannot be solved purely locally, and no single country can solve them alone. More and more collective effort will be needed to tackle these challenges. And the global multilateral processes that Tommy was so engaged in, the law of the sea, climate change, looking after the natural heritage of mankind, all these things, in fact, become more salient. And that's why, Tommy, you can always be proud of the fact that you were ahead of the curve. And we need that approach, that multilateral, mutual respect, interdependence, and cooperation. We need these approaches more than ever before. Finally, ASEAN herself has had to contend with our own internal challenges. The 10 ASEAN member states are highly diverse in terms of our political, economic, and social systems. In fact, I believe we may be the most diverse grouping in the world. You have 10 very different countries, difference in size, difference in population, difference in religion. We've got political systems that range from absolute monarchy to democracy to military arrangements. I really don't think you'll find a more diverse group of countries. And much has been asked about this ASEAN habit of consensus, of seeking consensus, and whether this is a bug or a design feature. And my point is that, in fact, it is a design feature. It is designed because of the great diversity within ASEAN. And consensus is a necessary fail-safe. It ensures that every member, regardless of our size, regardless of our politics, regardless of the state of our economic development, every member has an equal voice. Or another way of expressing it, every member has a veto. Consensus forces us to take an enlightened, long-term view of our own national interests vis-a-vis the larger, long-term regional interests. And in a sense, that somewhat slower, that more laborious process of achieving consensus, nevertheless, allows us, in my opinion, to achieve more sustainable solutions. Because you know that when we've signed, everyone has thought through it, worked through the implications, and has agreed to stand by it. So consensus is a design feature and is the foundation of ASEAN unity. The fundamental question, however, whenever events and challenges arise, is to what extent can we make the optimal trade-off between pursuing our own national interests versus the broader, long-term regional interests. Despite the challenges that we face, both internally as well as externally that I've outlined, I remain optimistic that our prospects are bright for the next 50 years. And let me bring you back on a journey, or rather on the journey that we have made in the last 50 years, to understand why I retain that sense of optimism. Think about 1967. In fact, it was a time of great geopolitical instability. There were even conflicts within the original 5 member states of ASEAN. In 1967, it was just 2 years after we had been ejected from Malaysia. There were still territorial claims between Philippines and Malaysia. The confrontasi between Indonesia versus Malaysia, the formation of Malaysia, was not fully resolved yet. We even had Indonesian Marines on trial for a terrorist bombing in McDonald House in Orchard Road. So to imagine that at the zenith of the Cold War, with the conflict in full force in Indochina, that this unlikely motley crew of 5 could get together despite our very fundamental differences actually was a major achievement. And it's also worthwhile remembering that this original 5 really consisted of non-communist Southeast Asia. And by getting together and therefore having those first critical 2 to 3 decades of peace amongst ourselves and time to invest in our infrastructure, invest in our people, and to prove that an economic model of openness, of trade, of liberalization works. In fact, we were ahead of the curve. Today, you call it globalization. Today, virtually every region of the world operates on that. Although, as I've said earlier, there are some questions about the limits of globalization. And we must give credit, due credit, therefore, to ASEAN for simply preventing war amongst the original members. And in fact, subsequently, when we included Vietnam in 1995, Laos and Myanmar in 97, and then Cambodia in 99. The point I want to make is that there has been no outright conflict, war, or battle between ASEAN member states. And in this day and age, this is an achievement worth celebrating. It is also worth recalling that one of ASEAN's most high-profile diplomatic campaigns was in the aftermath of the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia in 1979. And Professor Tommy Koh and our pioneer diplomats will remember that in fact ASEAN was swimming against conventional wisdom at the UN at that point in time. Nevertheless, ASEAN stood united and raised this point that we do not stand or tolerate foreign intervention, and we want to assert the rights of self-determination for our member states. Again, as I said, against conventional wisdom, ahead of its time, but we succeeded. And when the Cold War ended, and which in turn led to ASEAN's expansion, the point here is that if you think about it, ASEAN's formation, ASEAN's growth, and ASEAN's challenges have always everything to do with what happens on the global stage. So it comes back to this point that our need for consensus and our need for unity in order to preserve our centrality and relevance in the rest of the world is always, always at play. It's worthwhile contemplating the opposite scenario. If ASEAN had not been formed, if we had not insisted on consensus as a design feature, I think the opposite scenario for Southeast Asia in the last 50 years without ASEAN is that we would have been a collection of proxies and vassal states to the major powers of the day. And that would not have been a recipe for peace, prosperity, and the economic transformation which we have witnessed over the last 50 years. Therefore, unity and centrality for ASEAN are key for our survival. And as PM Lee has put it, ASEAN today is a lifeboat for all 10 member states to come together, to work together, and to have our voice heard on the global stage. So it is imperative that we do not break ranks and we do not sacrifice the long-term regional good in favor of narrower, short-term national interests. Otherwise, no one will take us seriously. You know, I'm always amazed at ASEAN summits and then the EAS summit that the leaders from America, China, Russia, Australia, New Zealand, India, all bother to come and engage us. And if ASEAN was not successful, if ASEAN was not united, if ASEAN didn't matter, I don't think those leaders would bother to come and see us every year. So the point here is for ASEAN to remain credible, relevant, and central is an imperative for us. But it is also in our hands, in our leaders' hands, to get the right balance between emphasizing regional unity while still guarding our long-term national interests. ASEAN's always going to be affected by what happens externally, and our short history of 50 years has illustrated that. The challenge is whether we allow these external tsunamis to overwhelm us, to divide us, or whether we collectively build a bigger, stronger ship that will allow us to navigate out of danger and to expand opportunities for all our people. We need and we want ASEAN to be adaptable, and we want ASEAN to be able to seize the new opportunities that the ongoing digital revolution will bring, and to formulate innovative ways to deal with these new challenges, and especially the transboundary challenges that I've outlined earlier. So that's why Singapore, as the incoming chair of ASEAN, wants to focus on strengthening ASEAN's resilience and expanding our innovative capacity. Resilience and innovation will underpin cooperation across all three community pillars of ASEAN under our chairmanship. And let me just list a few to give you a flavor of what we're trying to do. First, think about the digital revolution, about e-commerce, the way it's transforming supply chains, the way production and value is being transformed. We hope to establish an ASEAN Smart Cities network. It will connect people and economies seamlessly. It will enable ideas and solutions to flow across our entire region. Second, we hope to build and enhance collective resilience against common threats such as terrorism, violent extremism, and transnational crimes. We need to step up, and to step up urgently, collaboration on cybersecurity, because you can't have a smarter world. You can't have e-commerce. You can't have seamless digital transactions if you don't have cybersecurity. It's the flip side of the coin. So we will need a robust cybersecurity regime in order to provide assurances and opportunities for our people and our businesses. We will also work towards completing a model ASEAN extradition treaty, which will be an important step in strengthening the regional rule of law. Third, we will continue to invest in our people. 60% of ASEAN's population of 628 million are below the age of 35. Just now I referred to this issue of a demographic drought that has occurred in Northeast Asia and in some parts of Europe. The fact that ASEAN is young and we have not yet harvested our demographic dividend is a source of great opportunity. But, and there is a but, young people are a source of great opportunity and inspiration if we ensure that they have the relevant skills and that governments have invested in the latest up-to-date infrastructure, and that our social, political, and economic systems give people opportunities, fair opportunities. If we can achieve this, then a young ASEAN with a population larger than Europe in a region of peace, and a region that connects Northeast Asia, South Asia, including India, Australia and New Zealand, and across the Pacific, we are in the middle of all the action. Fourth, we will continue to strengthen economic and financial resilience whilst deepening our ties with external partners. What does this mean? It basically means we want to give everyone a bigger stake in our region's continued prosperity. When we meet superpowers, my usual line to them is, it is in your own long-term interest for ASEAN to succeed, because ASEAN will ultimately be your biggest trading partner. ASEAN will be your great opportunity for investments. The key word, the key concept behind this is interdependence. We believe the way to secure peace is to promote interdependence, and then to tell everyone that you gain more by working together, by investing in one another, by trading with one another, win-win outcomes. Because the opposite scenario is to divide the world into rival blocs, insist on narrow independence, engage in zero-sum competition, and ultimately proxy wars. So, economic, political interdependence is our recipe for peace and prosperity. We will therefore step up our efforts to achieve a high-quality regional comprehensive economic partnership. This is a free trade pact that includes all the 10 ASEAN countries and the 6 partners of ASEAN whom we already have free trade arrangements with. The 6, you know who they are: China, India, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, and Japan. If we put all this together, you account for more than 30% of global GDP and about 40% of the global population. And of course, our longer-term aim is to achieve a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So whether you talk about the RCEP or TPP, to us, they are just multiple roads that lead to a larger destination. So we will also bolster regional business opportunities, particularly for small and medium enterprises, by advancing the ASEAN single window and the ASEAN-wide self-certification regime. I should add that it is also worth emphasizing that at a recent ASEAN summit in Manila, ASEAN and China formally announced the commencement of negotiations for the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. This has been long overdue. The DOC, the declaration, was signed 2002, a long time ago. This is a very positive sign, an icon that both China and ASEAN countries want to achieve peace and stability and to ensure that the South China Sea remains a calm sea. And this is crucial. This is crucial because this is a critical artery for free trade, and free trade is essential for the economic development and transformation of our region. So in closing, let me just say that we've come a long way. There's much to celebrate, much to be proud of. The challenges that we've overcome are also salutary reminders. Reminders that ASEAN will always be subject to external forces, and we have to take the world as it is and make the necessary adjustments. It's a reminder that there will always be a premium on maintaining ASEAN unity in order for us to remain relevant and in order to give truth to this concept of ASEAN centrality. And it is also a reminder that we remain a region with tremendous potential. But achieving that potential will require that we pay attention to some fundamentals and that we get the balance right between protecting regional unity and relevance, and whilst at the same time advancing our own long-term national interests. So I conclude with the fact that our prospects remain bright, and Singapore as ASEAN chair will do our best as ASEAN makes its first steps into the next 50 years towards that bright future that our people demand and expect.